with you, Brian, we'll go ahead and get started. And I think Bill is kindly moderating the
Gotcha.
discussion today, if I'm not mistaken. Bill, is that right?
I
Okay.
gotcha.
Okay. Awesome. No, that sounds great. Well, welcome everyone. Somehow we're already in week 4 of the Spring Colloque series, so we're really rolling at this point. Just as a quick reminder, we are featuring Bryan Bruns today, and we're going to do a proper introduction just in a second. Thank you so much, Bill, for taking this on. And then Wednesday, we do have another research series event. And this time around, we're going to be featuring our very own Ostrom Fellow, Daphna Ratchuk, talking about developmental aid institutions and HIV in Ukraine. Very important and timely topic. There's going to be some other cool stuff that's in the offing, so you'll be just kind of be on the lookout for announcements for some of this, but there's various initiatives that we have underway that we are looking forward to looping you in on and getting your feedback on as well. So more to come on that. But for now, let's turn over to Bill to properly introduce Bryan. And just as a reminder, guys, really nice, helpful chat last week. For the speakers, we'll save a copy of the chat, so don't feel like you have to quickly, write everything down. And then, per usual, feel free to use the raise hand feature or the chat box for other questions, comments, critiques. So thank you so much, Bryan, for allowing us to feature your work. And thank you, Bill, for moderating.
My pleasure. Thanks, Scott. And welcome, everybody. And Bryan has also agreed to stick around after our 1 o'clock adjournment. So we're going to do what we've started to experiment with the last couple of colloquia, which is to just leave the Zoom link open for 20 minutes after 1 o'clock. So 1 o'clock will still be our formal adjournment, but people who want to hang around and chat with Bryan or chat with each other on the open Zoom link can do so. Okay. If you have questions for Bryan, as Scott said, you can either click on the participants button and use the raise hand feature, or just type into the chat. You don't have to type out your whole question. You can just type out real briefly, like, I have a question or something like that, and that'll just put you in the queue and I'll call on you. All right, Bryan Bruns is well known to us, been a part of the workshop community for several years. Bryan, if you don't know him already, is an independent consulting sociologist. His client list includes, among others, the UN, the World Bank, Oxfam, Ford Foundation, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. And among the places Bryan has worked are the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. He holds master's and doctoral degrees in sociology of development from Cornell University, and Bryan was a visiting scholar at the Ostrom Workshop from during 2009-10. Lately, Bryan's been working on representations of collective action and coordination situations, identifying ways to visually depict similarities and differences among them, and he's going to share some of that with us today in connection with his paper, Diagnosing Social Dilemmas in Commons. Bryan, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me go and get switched over to share screen, and then I'll start. Okay, so can you see the screen okay?
Yes, looks good.
Good. Okay, okay, good. Welcome. I'm going to talk about diagnosing social dilemmas in commons. Why would we want to diagnose? Well, it turns out there are multiple kinds of problems, and different problems require different solutions. And that's kind of what I'm going to help offer some ways to look at. And I'm linking some of this to some kind of workshop themes. So part of this is understanding complexity, that through looking at changes in the ranking of outcomes, we can get a map of different kinds of collective action problems and the potential for transforming between situations. And institutional diversity, that there are different kinds of problems, and we'll see actually there are a lot of problems with inequality that may leave somebody dissatisfied. As Lynn Ostrom liked to say, people are not prisoners. They can change the rules. Sometimes the best solution is to change the game. And then some stuff I'm still more thinking through in terms of design principles when you have incomplete information, and how you can work with that. So, yeah, good. Okay. Whoops, that's not where I want it to be. Okay. Okay, good. So talking about work in progress here. So welcome feedback, both ways to perhaps be clearer about sharing these ideas and potential applications and extensions, collaboration, what have you. I'm going to first start with a fairly detailed example and then kind of zoom way out and move fairly quickly through discussion of this project and some related work. I may talk about climate change examples, the global public bad of all of us pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. You're welcome to think about whatever examples are relevant to your work, whether it's sharing pasture or sharing knowledge commons, like where this picture of the sheep came from, or we have here a picture of where I worked in northern Nigeria and a couple farmers concerned about, okay, how do we maintain our irrigation system and share water? Thanks to those of you who leave your Zoom open, like James Boyle suggested last week. It does make it kind of more interesting for the speaker, in the sense there's an audience out here. So the key example that I'll be using here is the potential to turn a prisoner's dilemma into a stag hunt. That we have the classic prisoner's dilemma problem that we could cooperate and do pretty well, but if we look at the situation, it's as if, well, whatever you do, I'm better off defecting, not cooperating. And if you do the same, then we both end up in this inferior equilibrium and can be kind of stuck there as a Nash equilibrium. The kind of secret sauce of what I'm talking about today, building on work by David Robinson and Goforth, is that if you switch the top two payoffs, the 4 and the 3, for both players, you can change the game and get a very different kind of game. And in this case, you turn it into a stag hunt. So you go from this kind of potentially tragic problem of people defecting, being tempted to defect from cooperation, to something where you have two potential solutions, both of which would be stable and work, one of which is much better and can be a problem of building trust enough for how to get to that win-win solution if it's riskier. Now, the next kind of simple operation that Robinson-Goforth did and helps understand this is you can combine payoffs from different games. So here, one person has the payoffs from a stag hunt, the other has payoffs from prisoner's dilemma. Again, it's this kind of potentially tragic situation where dominant strategies take you to an inferior equilibrium. However, there's still a better option if you could find a way to get there, including cases where you can talk, play repeatedly, and other things that may be more favorable for cooperation. But in this case, somebody's going to do better, which may pose some challenges in terms of how you organize cooperation. You can extend the same process by switching the lowest two payoffs, and you can turn prisoner's dilemma into the game of chicken, also talked about as hawk dove in biology, or snowdrift, this classic two cars going at each other. If somebody swerves, the other one wins. If they crash into each other, disaster, worst for everybody. Now, people had known about these transformations, and there's a review article by Peter Colloquium around 1998 where he plays with some of this for social dilemmas. What Robinson-Goforth did is take it much more seriously and think about it in terms of geometry and topology and how games are linked to each other by these payoff swaps. And what if you keep doing these swaps, and how can we show all these links? Back to that screen. Okay. So this is the part of the presentation where I'm going to wave my hands a little bit and say, if you want more, you can look at the paper. You can also look at Robinson-Goforth's book, especially if you would like a slightly more mathematical treatment, still kind of high school algebra and other stuff that they introduce. But you continue this process, you end up with some more conflict games, a bunch more win-win games. You end up with a variety of asymmetric games, and you end up with what they call the periodic table of 2x2 games. You still have these symmetric games on the diagonal, and they combine payoffs to make a whole bunch of asymmetric games. And this is what gives a map of collective action problems. So we end up not just one symmetric prisoner's dilemma, but a set of asymmetric dilemmas. We end up with a little herd of stag hunts. We end up with some win-win games, some where the invisible hand gets you to win-win, others where you need at least a bit of a theory of mind to anticipate what the other person could do, some games where you might compromise on second best, a whole bunch of games where somebody does better and therefore somebody else may not be as happy about the outcome, games with no equilibrium solution, or sad games where nobody wins, or one where the fight over who comes out better. And many ways to win. Some of you might have noticed there's some fairly simple wording here. This is deliberate and something I'm kind of playing with. My Christmas present for this year from my cousin was a book by Randall Munroe, who you may know as the XKCD cartoonist, about the thing explainer, using the 1,000 most common words in English to explain things. And after 10 years of working on this and realizing I've got very caught up in language and asymmetric and what have you, and as if I can assume I'm talking to people who work with game theory, I'm kind of having fun using some different language here. And you're welcome to feedback on that. Okay, this is just a quick visual thing. Again, there are lots of games which somebody wins, somebody else is worse. They may be unhappy, they might like to change things. And this map also points out a lot of these games can be fixed, can be improved. You're only 1 or 2 steps away from a win-win game. The map also gives you a basis for thinking about how to diagnose what kind of situation you're in, including if you have fairly limited information. You don't have to know necessarily the full payoff structure. You can figure out, are you in the classic prisoner's dilemma situation with one inferior Nash equilibrium, or often the word discussion of social dilemma and free rider problems gets used in a broader, looser way where there are problems with cooperation, temptations to defect, and you can figure out, okay, is that chicken where there's this temptation to defect, but potential disaster or brinksmanship, somebody's going to come out better, or are you back in a kind of stag hunt problem? You can do this in a more detailed way to figure out which kind of region in that map you come out into, and therefore what kind of problem, what kind of solutions may be relevant. Something I'm also working on, if you do have your full set of payoffs, and right now it's just an Excel spreadsheet, which works for most, but not all payoff structures. You can plug in the numbers and see, okay, what game are you in? Where are you in this table? Okay, now I'm going to go fairly quickly through some related work that also applies some of these ideas. So with Christian Kimmich, we've been working on a paper on archetypal games. And again, you can start with a very simple operation. You make ties between the lowest 2 payoffs in Prisoner's Dilemma and Chicken, and you end up with a game in between those. Do that for the highest payoffs, and you end up in this simple exchange or Avatam Saka game where I totally control what happens to you, but I have no control over my own outcome, and vice versa. Another place you end up, these 3 kind of primal archetypes, is the simplest coordination game, like which side of the road do we drive on? Either one would work, but let's pick one. Or something where we each have control over our own outcome. And you can reverse this process and break those ties and get emergent properties in interesting ways. You can also take these 3 games and combine their payoffs, and you end up with some archetypes that help think about some things like workshop kind of stuff of, concern with power with. that Vincent talked about and pointed back to Mary Parker Follett. What can we do together? You also get some archetypes for inequality, power, dependence, and some things that, at least for me, can help illustrate some of the kind of deontic relationships in the institutional grammar of where one person has control over what the other person may get or must get or cannot get. Also have a chapter that's coming out that applies some of this to climate negotiations, and you can look at the range of models, and this responds to earlier work by DeCanio and Fremstadt. And you can also look at this kind of microcosm, which covers most of the important kinds of situations, and think about pathways to solutions, both symmetric pathways and asymmetric pathways, which may not have gotten so much attention. How could you get to a solution to climate change, even if the other side never thinks that stopping pollution would be their best move? Seth Frey, let's see, Christian Kimmich is also a workshop scholar. Also Seth Frey, who I overlapped with at the workshop, took some of this and ran with it in terms of n-person games when you have more than 2 people. And there's a paper that came out the end of last year that has some interesting stuff on how even purely selfish agents could end up doing pretty well, getting disproportionately to win-win in small groups, dyads, or when there are a few people. To add a couple of things from work we did but didn't get published, because I discovered somebody had proved the thing that was going to be the basis for the paper already. But we still have some interesting findings. Inequality becomes a much bigger problem and more of a concern as the number of participants rises. In terms of diagnosing problems, you have many fewer situations where there's a single equilibrium. So you need to think more about solution concepts where there's either no equilibrium, but maybe there's a focal point that's prominent somehow, or multiple equilibrium. Can we somehow come up with a convention that lets us correlate, orchestrate what we do, or satisficing, finding something that's good enough so we don't end up searching forever? Another thing, again, I'm experimenting with different ways to share these ideas and see what might get some interest and such. So using Twitter to both share these kind of card images of the games and my little attempts at haiku to look at some of these issues. And if you're interested, you can follow me on Twitter or search on 2x2 haiku and simple words explanations of some of these different game situations. So again, I'm coming here both to share these ideas because I think they offer some tools that can be quite relevant for a lot of the things a lot of us are interested in working on, for diagnosis, for problem solving, for understanding potential pathways to solutions. And quite frankly, as someone who doesn't have an institutional affiliation and never got the skill set for getting grants, I would love it if I could find some way to get some funding to work more on this, and ways to work with other people, which I've enjoyed with both Seth and Christian and such. And so feel free to get in touch if some of this interests you. Okay, so to conclude, again, these are kind of the highlights that came over in the beginning in terms of understanding complexity, that looking at changes in the ranking of outcomes gives us a way to map diversity of different kinds of collective action problems and the potential transformations. It's a map you can see where you are and where you could get to. Looking at that map, Prisoner's Dilemma is one of only many problems. And a whole lot of those problems concern inequality, unsatisfactory situations. And given that that's a point on which the workshop has been criticized or seen as a weak point, I think it's interesting both the prevalence of those kind of situations. So inefficiency in Prisoner's Dilemma or even in Stag Hunt is not the only major problem, and maybe not even the most common problem. and thinking about the potential to remedy inequality problems may deserve a lot more attention. And these are at least some simple toy tools for dealing with that. The more general point that people are not prisoners, self-governance. People can be institutional artisans. They can create rules, find better ways to work together. Sometimes the best solution is to change the game or just to go play some other game. And we have this key example, which if you only took away one thing from today, would be this kind of idea. If it seems like you're trapped or somebody's trapped in prisoner's dilemma, think about, is there a way to escape by turning this into a stag hunt coordination kind of problem? And then thinking in terms of the design principles, what does it mean if usually we don't know all the payoffs? And sometimes those payoffs may be varying and shifting around, and that has implications for how we diagnose and how we think about solutions. And I'm going to stop here and thank you for your time and attention and look forward to comments. Okay.
Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate it. And just a quick reminder, I've already seen a hand up, and so I'm going to turn over to the queue here in just a minute. But just as a reminder, in case you joined us after Brian got started, you can either click on the participants button at the bottom of your screen and use the raise hand function to let me know you want to be recognized, or you can just type into the chat real quickly, I have a question or something like that. And I'll be happy to call on you. But Gustavo, you were the first with your hand up, and so I'm gonna let you kick us off. I've got Jess in line behind you, and the queue is open after that. Gustavo.
Okay, hi everybody. So Brian, interesting stuff. So I have many questions, but I will just start with one. Something that I think usually happens in real situations that we try to model with game theory is that when you try to think of the changes in the rules of the game, that in some sense is a game in itself, and it's costly to change the rules, no? So again, do you have some thoughts about that? So you either have to define like a meta game, or again, take into account that it's not so simple when you're starting with some game to start playing around how to redesign the game in some sense.
Yeah, good. That's actually part of what Seth tries to set up in his paper. He precisely uses this topology of n-person games and sets it up so you have little agents who are playing repeatedly, but rather than being stuck in just one game and trying to optimize in that game, there's the choice to switch to another game. And he looks at how they can follow pathways and where they end up. And the paper key result is to say, at least when there are a few people, they have a much better chance of getting to win-win. And then the main claim in the paper is fairly modest, but if you look at the discussion section, he clearly thinks he's on to something bigger, which is what you're talking about. How do we have models for situations with endogenous changes in the rules? People can switch what the game is, and this setup gives a simple way to look at that and how some of that happens. So one of the things that didn't make it into the paper, though I wish he had included it, actually, if you put in even very mild pro-social preferences, which he starts with purely selfish agents, but if you put in even very mild pro-social preferences, I care about what happens to you a little bit, turns out that it's quite easy to get to win-win, which again has implications. And as you may know, among Lynn's many papers, this one, I'm not going to give the title correct now, but about kind of norms and conditional cooperators, and saying, again, a much better set of starting assumptions is that people are ready to cooperate and give the benefit of the doubt and try and be nice first. It's not that they're totally innocent or whatever, but that gives you a much better starting point to think about what's going on. Another thing in terms of modeling, which I've only just kind of thought about, but if somebody wanted to be systematic, you can use transaction costs to think about, okay, how difficult is this change? The key thing Robinson-Goforth did in the topology is to say, okay, swapping the lowest payoffs, those are the games that are closest to each other. Least different, easiest to make the change. If you're trying to reach agreement or have side payments or whatever, that's probably the easiest part. Swapping middle payments, payoffs more difficult, swapping the top payoffs even more difficult. So that gives you a way that you can think about the kind of transaction costs of getting to a different game. And at least for me, because I like some of what Stuart Kaufman has done, he talks about the adjacent possible. And he's building on like chemistry analogies. What if we've got this molecule, what's the nearest thing we can get to? And that can be quite rigorous in terms of energy and thresholds and so on, or much looser and more heuristic to think about, okay, what is the adjacent possible? And this gives a map for these little toy systems of the adjacent possible. And since last night, I finally looked at the Ostrom Book Club recording, Mike McGinnis was talking about looking more systematically in navigating strategic situations. How can we figure out where we could get to?
Okay, thanks, Brian. I have many other questions, but we can talk later. Okay,
Yeah,
so other people have also the chance of asking questions. Thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you both. Jess, floor is yours. And then again, the next question is open for anybody who wants to raise hand or let me know in chat.
Okay, so I thought this was super interesting in a variety of ways. And I think I have many, many questions as well, but they are not super well formulated. So I'm just going to start with the two that I think will be understandable outside of my own head. The first is, to my understanding, right, this is really about like understanding how easy it is to switch the rankings of the outcomes, right, for the most part. And one question I have is, to what extent would we expect that to correlate with how easy it is that players identify and arrive at the equilibria, and how much does that matter in these rankings, right? So you've talked about changing the actual payoff structure, right, with the idea that that creates, these the sort of the traditional things that we're concerned about, right? It shifts the set of incentives that we care about. But I was thinking about a Bednar and Page paper about entropy and how we think about some games being harder to solve than others on the part of particular players. And this may be way outside of the scope of this paper, or it may be directly correlated to this particular mapping. And that is is it the case that we have any understanding that, or any expectations of, or maybe I'm being incredibly naive and this is already built into this, that actors, that each of these particular swaps may or may not decrease the time it takes actors to arrive at particular equilibria.
Yeah.
So that's my first question. My second is more of a comment, and it had to do with your statement about like grant writing and this. And it seems like there's just like you arrive at the I think the best framing of this paper early in the discussion section, and I think that in terms of like, if you are looking for grant applications and things like that, that up front saying like, look, we often identify problems and then create models to understand the set of incentives that are at work here, right? But like what you're doing, and I'm not saying all game theorists do that, but you're doing kind of the opposite in some ways, right? Like you're saying, how could we design or identify problems that are easier to solve and make our current problems into those problems, right? And to me, that has like so many amazing, phenomenal places for application that I can't imagine a grant agency that wouldn't be interested in that when framed that way, right? It's essentially, right, it's just saying like, okay, this is what our current problem is, right? If we shift these small things, we create this problem, and this is solvable in the following ways, right? So that seems to me imminently sellable, as it were. But that neither here nor there. I'm particularly interested in this first question about sort of like entropy or level of complexity or time it takes individual players to like actually solve these games, and whether you can measure that according to the different swaps that you're making.
Okay, good. Get back to the diagram. Okay, so thank you for the suggestions and encouragement, which is very good. And in question of, okay, some games are more difficult, and how would that affect the, if I understand the question, inclination to either, try and sort things out within the game or try and change the game. And so a simple extreme example can be these cyclic games where, if you just follow the preference structures and there's no stopping rule, people will keep going around, potentially forever, or at least you could be quite frustrated going there. And the map actually shows how this game, and part of what I skipped over, this whole diagram is actually like, here's my teaching aid, a donut, a torus. It wraps from left to right and top to bottom. So this cyclic game over here is actually only one step away from a win-win game here. So that's kind of an extreme example of where it could be better to switch the game you're playing. And again, the point of having all these one winner games, whatever you call them, they give an advantage to one person. Lisa Martin called them suasion games. Zern called them Rambo games because somebody gets what they want without having to compromise. But if they leave somebody dissatisfied, that's the potential and concern for trying to, okay, maybe rather than just continuing to negotiate within this situation, do we have somewhere we can change the whole situation? Put something else on the table, bring somebody else in, whatever. So that those give ways to think about that. And I'll go ahead and mention here, some of this originally came out of work on Samaritan's Dilemma and aid to irrigation systems and how to think about better solutions for that, particularly the challenge that assistance could end up reducing the effort. And do you see that as a problem? Or do you actually say, well, maybe those people have some real reasons they'd rather put their effort into something else and appreciate it? And you can map how that change is the payoff structure for the donor, or you can think about the classic conditionality, require matching cost sharing arrangements. Okay, so that's some answers. Check back to what extent you have more questions or, need to do more.
I'm going to reflect a little bit more. Maybe I'll talk to you offline when I have my thoughts a little bit better in order, but that was helpful. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to ask you, Bryan, one of the things, the expression pracademic is now probably overused and perhaps inappropriate in your case, but one of the things that I respect and appreciate about you is the fact that you both, think about these things from and their epistemological and methodological puzzles, and you also work in the field. And I want you to think out loud with us a little bit about when you are interacting with folks who are trying to solve issues and overcome and solve problems in the field. In what ways have you found this way of thinking useful, and how easily is it communicated to folks who may not have thought about games or games in normal form like this?
Okay, in terms of kind of explicitly and deliberately applying it in the field is not something I'd say I've done that much or had that much success. The time I tried to explain some of this when I was with the Foundation in Ecological Security in India, and they were interested, okay, you've got these cards and what have you. So that's something I'm still very much working on. And part of the reason I was working with Christian Kimmich in the first place is he did some great work looking at groundwater use in India and adjacent action situations and saying some of these are not prisoner's dilemma situations, they're a coordination problem. And that has to do with the details of voltage surges and little things you can put on to prevent that, but creates a threshold kind of situation where if enough other people install this gadget, it's good. Otherwise, you're wasting money. So the key starting point is just to say, okay, again, coordination problems are different. And this gives a way to think about a different kind of problem. And to back one step up from that, just for me and probably for a lot of us, the original thing which I got from Mansur Olson, that we can't take it for granted the collective action will actually happen. And therefore we need to think about what can be done to bring people together, to understand the interests, to understand arrangements, to look at ways that are already cooperating. And the other one I would link here, and more generally in terms of some of this philosophy, is the other regarding preferences part. Lynn talked about adding little delta values. So you have your own immediate concerns, but you care about what other people feel. That the simple act of doing an irrigation walkthrough and getting people from the head end of the system to see what's going on in the tail end often generates understanding and empathy. And to be analytic, that may change their perception and their willingness to engage in cooperation, whereas otherwise it was like a classic externality. They were doing what seemed best for them and not understanding the consequences. So those are some practical ways that it links to some of this, and I'd very much say I'm still working on it in terms of better ways to share or apply these ideas. Thanks.
Also, I just wanted to follow up on, in some ways, this is of a question that Jess was just asking, but in some cases, you're looking at how to change a game that has a determinate solution, like a prisoner's dilemma. A prisoner's dilemma has a determinate solution, it has an equilibrium. It's a lousy equilibrium, it's a tragic equilibrium, but it has an equilibrium. But you change that to a coordination game, and one of the features of a lot of coordination games, including Stag Hunt, is it doesn't have a determinate equilibrium. I mean, what actually happens in when people are in a coordination situation that's modelable as a Stag Hunt is they have to come up with a solution, whereas the prisoner's dilemma kind of drives people, unless they have the most extraordinary other regarding preferences that one can imagine, it kind of drives people towards this tragic non-cooperative solution. So you may be changing a game from tragic to better, but you're not necessarily changing a game from harder to solve to easier to solve. In fact, you may be changing a game from easier to solve to harder to solve. So thoughts on that?
I guess in part, if people played Prisoner's Dilemma just at the minimal level of I follow my impulses and get stuck, yes. I think for a whole lot of us, Prisoner's Dilemma is caught up in, again, the research Lynn was involved with Jimmy and others, to say, wait a minute, even let people talk to each other, and they figure out ways to cooperate. And all the more so if it's repeated play where actual cooperation is a solution. But even people start out wanting to cooperate, they're willing to cooperate even if you try and make it anonymous and they're only playing once. But if you give people a little room, they will cooperate. So that's in a sense what I'm comparing to. Stag Hunt for me would see it as, maybe I need to think more. I tend to think of it as easier to solve because there is clearly the potential to get to the stable win-win equilibrium if you can coordinate, orchestrate, and in the case of Stag Hunt, overcome the risk that, okay, if I do the cooperative move and you don't, I'm going to end up in my worst outcome, and deal with that challenge. And the other part would be, again, just changing the mindset, which keeps coming up, including some of the discussions about Lynn and Vincent, and some of what Jamie was talking about last Wednesday. If we think about this as a world that at least in some ways we can make changes at, that's a different perspective on things rather than just the local hill climbing.
Yeah, and it brings up, I'm in the absence of other people stepping in, and Gustavo said he had some additional questions. So Gustavo, if you want to jump in, but let me just follow up on this one point, because
it looks like Tom also has maybe a point too. Sorry about that.
Oh, thank you so much. I missed that. So one of the things that Lynn did, starting in the, I think, 1980s, was writing about games and action situations, and the sort of the 7 types of rules that structure an action situation. And one of those is the payoff. One of those 7 is the payoff rules. Change payoffs to change the situation. But there are lots of other things that you can change. And granted, we want to keep it 2 by 2. So I won't say let's change the number of participants or let's change the number of positions, which would be options, but stay within the confines of a 2 by 2. Some of what you're talking about is changing, like the information, what you would call the information rules. Who knows what? Who has to communicate what, or who may or must not, who may or must not communicate what to whom. And so that even popped to mind when you were talking about that situation where you take the head enders and you walk them all the way down to the tail end of the irrigation system. That you haven't necessarily changed the payoffs in the game, but you've certainly changed the information that the participants have about the game. In what ways is it useful, and in what ways is it complicating to think like that?
I think I may mainly take this as a comment, because for me, thinking through the 7 rule types is something I read and I try and work with, but don't necessarily always find intuitive, or I come to grasp different parts of it. Okay. So one of the things about stag hunts is in using that as a model for in-person games, the question of distinguishing, is it the risk of losing out that is the danger, or is it much more just the aggregation problem of we've got so many people, how do you get them to organize themselves and converge on one outcome? So that may not be a very satisfactory answer, but thank you.
No, it's fine. You haven't worked at this from that angle before. That's perfectly reasonable response. Scott, who did I overlook as far as having a question? I want to make sure.
You might have already mentioned this, Brian, I can't remember, but Tom Schneider, I'm not sure, Tom, if you're still on the line.
Oh, cool, thanks.
How the games are actually played.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Flipping through, I'm not sure if I see Tom, so you might have had to drop off, but I'm not sure if you care to go back to that part of the presentation, Brian, and kind of elucidate on that a little bit.
In the meantime, I just got a note from Dean. Dean has a question.
I'm still here.
Oh, sorry, Tom.
I'm so sorry,
Yeah.
Tom, I missed you.
Tom, please go ahead.
I figured you could just look at the question. Are there any data on how the games are actually played? In other words, you're making theoretical constructs, but how does that actually happen in the real world? And have people gathered data that you could actually look at?
Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff there. So again, the huge history of laboratory experiments, using, typically undergrad students, but other people, and looking at those kind of games. And part of what a key foundation thing for this was for the work I'm doing in 2x2 games was Anatole Rappaport with Geyer and Gordon, the 2x2 game, where they tried to synthesize a whole bunch of this work. Since Tom is, I know Tom from other connections in DC and social dance and what have you, in terms of a bunch of people associated with the workshop and such, Marco Jansen, Juan Camilo Cardenas and such have been among pioneers of taking those experimental games out of the lab and doing them with people in the field and looking at, how does that differ or further confirm what's going on. So there's a bunch of evidence and kind of, to what extent I'm saying things, it is at least in interaction with that kind of literature on what happens when you have people play games, and as people have gotten creative to say, well, what happens if we can't punish people who cheat or give them other options, some of which start to be ways they can change the rules. There are also parallel lines of work in terms of doing simulation agents and looking at how they behave. Also, in terms of what could be done, Daniel Ballier in the Netherlands is doing neat stuff to try and set up to do meta-analysis, that there's been all this research with people with different payoff structures and trying to get that all together in a way that would make it easy to examine these kind of hypotheses. Now, when I talked to him about putting in the larger context, he made it very clear just doing it for prisoner's dilemma kind of experiments is an enormous amount of work already, and he was not ready to think about expanding to other games, but that is a potential that is down there. So yes, there is a lot to draw on. It's not something I've really worked at in terms of that kind of meta-analysis.
Well, meta-analysis isn't the raw data. I'm interested in raw data of how people actually play. And I'm just wondering if there are any databases or anybody's collecting the raw data. It's like genetics. You have whole genomes of organisms and you can get access to the raw data and manipulate it. And if it's been processed through meta or something, then you've lost the raw data and you're not free anymore.
Sorry. I'm not going to be able to come up with the citation right here, but again, when I talk about meta-analysis, exactly what Daniel Balliet, B-A-L-L-I-E-T, and colleagues are doing is pulling that data out of different articles, reports, and what have you, and putting it in form so people can see the raw data and trying to do that in a very complete thing, so that exactly people can dig into things that the original experimenters may not have paid attention to, may not have had enough enough samples, enough examples, but when you put it in the context of other experiments, you can get more statistical power, you can do more interesting comparisons.
Right. So meta-analysis takes multiple research and joins them into one, and maybe you have more power, but that doesn't give you the raw data. You have to go to the individual places and they may not be accessible and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in the actual raw data. When you have a particular game, maybe one of your periodic table, what happens when real people actually play that game? What are the actual raw data to that? And is there a database somewhere that contains those? So in other words, the game is a certain form, but the way people play it is probabilities that are different than that form. And the question is, what do people actually do? They're different things. It's sort of like there's a landscape, that's your game, but there are people on the landscape and they're clustering in different ways, maybe not even dependent, not out in the hollows and the peaks, they're in funny ways, and you want to know what those distributions are.
Okay, yeah, I think we can maybe talk about this more offline. Again, my understanding, what they're putting together is something, maybe I'm using the word meta-analysis differently. It's not just taking the conclusions from a bunch of studies, it's actually going back and reworking their original data to explore various questions. And again, there's a huge amount because it became, it was a staple of research in social psychology in particular, and then more recently, a lot of experimental economics. And you can come up with a little hypothesis and you can test it, and it often gives you a nice little publishable result. So people talk about the prisoner's dilemma as being like the E. coli of social science. There's been a huge amount of research on this one particular game to look at what goes on, including the fact that people often don't behave the way the kind of classic game theory assumptions expected. And that's what Lynn Ostrom and a lot of others have kept on finding, the very interesting ways in which people are more cooperative. And in terms of the kind of stuff you work on in evolutionary theory and biological examples and evolution, Michael Nowak has done a whole lot of work with this, mostly in simulation kind of contexts, and has a great book now from some years ago, Super Cooperators, which synthesizes a bunch of what he found from cooperation from that evolutionary game theory approach.
All right, so it's Danielle Balliet.
Balliet, Balliet. And I'll make a note and I'll send you an email.
All right, thanks.
All right, sorry, I had a little glitch there and dropped off the meeting. So if Dean hasn't asked his question of Bryan yet, Dean, you're up.
Okay, thanks, Bryan. I wondered if you could prove the discussion here by linking some of the games you think are most relevant to some of these actual cases that Lynn or others have studied in say, common property regimes. I mean, you can change, and we showed this here, that you can change the configuration of the payoffs, and then obviously the behavior will change. But have you tried to link some of these configurations to actual cases that people have studied? It's a little bit like the previous question, but in a way to get at what models are likely to be the most relevant, at least for maybe some classic cases of fisheries or pastures that we're familiar with.
Okay, I think two answers. One, just to be upfront in terms of doing some kind of detailed case study to work this through, while also showing, that with, kind of reasonable measures of payoffs, that's not something I've done. In terms of looking at these different kind of problems, one thing I have done, and it's just a couple of conference papers, is looking at groundwater and a particular example of an interesting project in India where it's like quantum tunneling. They did something that the original theory says should be impossible, because groundwater is usually analyzed as this classic tragic commons that it's hard to control, hard to measure, and therefore easy for people to end up in a kind of trap. And instead they went in with a very much information-based approach, and through that people were willing, without any sanctions, without changing the payoff structures that way, but through building assurance about shifting to a different crop, tomatoes, that would use less water and have a better chance of getting water through the season, and having a critical mass of people to do that. I at least thinking that is an example of this difference of something that's classically analyzed as a tragedy of the commons kind of situation, and one which this is an explanation for a very different approach, and why, because it's approaching as a coordination problem. As you may be aware, Dan Cole and Grossman have a nice paper talking about why the herder's problem is not a stag hunt, which shares, overlaps with a bunch of things I'm talking about in some ways, to say when you look more closely at the kind of decisions that are involved, that you can add one sheep at a time or more, you can see what other people are doing. As you walk through the different aspects of that situation, it becomes clear how many ways it's not a tragedy of the common situation, and therefore it's better to understand it as in simple terms, a stag hunt, or in more detailed terms, what the options are for and the kind of payoffs we're dealing with. There's also work in climate, which has used more models. Particularly, they talk about threshold games, which Stag Hunt gives you a way to model that. If we can get enough people to cooperate, if the EU and the US and China all say we're going to really go for renewable energy and we're going to support innovative research and drive down the costs there and scale out manufacturing and work up the learning curve there, you may have a critical mass that then transforms the situation through getting it across a threshold. So that's, I hope, at least a partial answer. Oh,
Hold on. This has been great, Bryan.
okay.
Bill, did we miss anybody? Or did we lose Bill again? Looks like maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
It looks like it, Bryan. Sorry about that. Yeah, just on your point about finding grant opportunities too, I'll follow up with you as well. But just
Okay,
listening to this, I think there's several, frankly, that come to mind that Kate Rasick, I'm sure, will help us do some matchmaking for. So we'll follow up after this is over. But I'd be shocked, frankly, if we couldn't find a team of folks who'd be interested in tackling some of this with you.
Yeah.
So I will do that right after we conclude here. But just any other final questions, guys? Any other comments for Bryan before we have to wrap things up here in just a minute?
Can I go?
Oh, sorry, Gustavo. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Just one question is maybe it's interesting to think to what extent these possibilities of flipping to different games are different from small versus large groups. So I tend to be more optimistic of this kind of more closer to the efficient institution view that people will figure out changes in small groups. But it's going to be more difficult when you think about, constitutional changes at the country level to go to the other extreme, no? And I think maybe playing around with that would be something interesting, at least from my perspective, or the type of research question that I am interested in. Just a comment, not for this work, but like for future work, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, and as a comment, and I'd point you to Seth's paper from December, which should be straightforward to find, which precisely, even just going from 1 up to 9 players, you can see how much more difficult and how some of the properties of the situation and the outcomes change, and as you scale bigger. Now, the other side of it, as you're perfectly well aware, is again modularity. Nesting, you can have smaller groups. And again, we use these models not just for 2-person, you can look at 1 person or 1 country, whether it makes sense for them to join a coalition. And having these toy 2-person models also gives you a way to think about, okay, when would it really make a difference to have somebody in who can be a facilitator or play some other role, so that, it's better to look at it as a triad or a multiple players. Good. And I'll just briefly advertise for something else coming up on Thursday. I coincidentally ended up with 2 talks this week. So for the polycentricity webinar, I'll be talking about the chapter from the book on governing complexity, and that's Thursday at 11 o'clock and Eastern Standard Time, and you can find the link from the IASC website for the polycentricity group. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bryan. And we welcome plugs. Happy to help spread the word too, okay? If you wanted to send us a little blurb, we'll push it out too,
okay,
if we haven't already. Well, hey, how about a virtual round of applause for Bryan? Thank you so much. Fascinating work. Thanks for giving us a chance to dive into it. I don't want to steal Bill's thunder if he joined us again. I'm just looking. I don't see him. So thank you. Thanks for bearing with, Bryan. And thank you all for joining. Just as a reminder, we're going to have our research series in a couple days here on Wednesday, and we'll be featuring Daphna in that. It's going to be a great discussion as well. So look forward to seeing you then. And until then, be safe, for those around Bloomington, Midwest, most of the country, really, be very safe. Looks like the snow is already falling. And thanks again, Bryan. That was great. Take care, everybody. Be well.